Good evening. Good evening and welcome on this warm evening in Winnipeg, and welcome to those of you that are watching us on live stream. Welcome to the book launch of On Holy Ground, Stories by and about women in ministry, leadership ministry in the Mennonite Brethren Church. It's the Historical Commission's publication of 16 first-person accounts of women's calls to ministry, edited by Dora Dueck from BC. And we're grateful to have 4 of the contributors here this evening to share something of their ministry journey with us. Elfrieda Neufeld Schroeder, Anne Isaak, Mary Reimer, and Laura Kalmar. Welcome. My name is Arlen. I am the director of Common Word, which is a national Anabaptist bookstore and library jointly operated by Canadian Mennonite University and Mennonite Church Canada, where it's possible to buy or borrow or access Anabaptist and related resources online. And it's our privilege to be hosting tonight's conversation. For those who are participating online, I invite you to send a chat message with your name and general location so we have a sense of who is joining us. Just to note that there are presently no COVID-related restrictions at Marpeck Commons, so mask use, for example, is optional. This conversation being live streamed is being recorded and will be kept online at Common Word for future viewers. After the presentations, there will be a short time for question and answer for some dialogue, and online viewers can submit their questions via the chat function, and I'll be monitoring those. After the formal part of the event, the book will be available, of course, to purchase in person at Common Word or online at commonword.ca for the promotional price of $20, including tax. And I've included a link to the book in the chat. We're in for a good conversation. Thanks for bearing with us in this heat. The sun is hot, even in here. I'm a little surprised how warm it is. Each contributor will give a short presentation, followed, as I said, by a time of question and answer. But before that, I welcome John Isaak, director at the Center for MB Studies and producer of this book, to give a short introduction and to better introduce our guests. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Arlen. It's very good to be together with you, and thank you so much for coming out on this hot day. It's special, very special. And thank you, too, for supporting these writers, these contributors, these ministers, these women ministers among the Mennonite Brethren. So, On Holy Ground is a production, a publication of the Historical Commission, but it is just one of the books that we've done recently. Last year, we produced this book, Mennonite Brethren Bible College, A History of Competing Visions, authored by Abe Dueck. And Arlen tells me there still are 10 copies of this book for sale in Common Word. We've been busy. This year, very pleased to announce, of course, this book, On Holy Ground. Special book. And of course, this is the reason we're here tonight, to honor 4 of the contributors. There are 16 in the book, but 4 of them are here. Actually, last week, I was in Abbotsford and we had another launch, and 4 of the Abbotsford area contributors did something like this, and we had a group like this in the Mennonite Heritage Museum to read and listen to their presentations. But you know, this book, On Holy Ground, has a long history. It's not just something that was put together recently, it goes back a ways. I have brought some books to show you. So, this book, some of you might recognize, from 1979. Great title, Women Among the Brethren. Katie Funk-Wiebe writes, and guess what? 15 contributors here, except these are biographies, not autobiographies. These are 15 women write about other significant women among the Mennonite Brethren. 1979. Fast forward a little bit. This was another book that the Historical Commission did 3 years ago. So yes, we have been busy. Doug Heidebrecht wrote this book. It is Women in Ministry Leadership, The Journey of the Mennonite Brethren from 1954 to 2010. But this one is a history book in the classical sense. Lots of footnotes, lots of references to meeting minutes, excerpts from the MB Herald, etc., etc. But one thing that the reviewers noticed right away is this is men talking about women. In some ways that's not new, right? But it is a bit unfortunate. So in 2020, the Historical Commission commissioned Dora Dueck to figure out and find and collect and curate women telling the story of Mennonite Brethren ministry people. So she went to work and she gathered stories of real women leaders among MBs. And these are first-person accounts. They are autobiographical. And she used the term life writing. Life writing meaning, of course, it's a bit memoir-ish, but it's focused, very focused around, in this case, ministry leadership. But life writing not only retells the stories, I mean, you'll notice when you read these, many of the women go back to various diaries or journals that they have collected, and they tell the story, but they also add analysis, like what's going on between the ears of these women as they are thinking about their experiences. So life writing joins a recitation of things from the past, but then looking at those things and analyzing and seeing what's going on. How their ministry calling took place, how it happened, how they have embraced it, some of the bumps and twists along the way, as well as the joys of ministry that they have experienced. Well, that was 2 years ago. In 2022, early in February, the Historical Commission met on Zoom, as we have been doing these last years, and I got authority to go forward and produce this book. And so, quick, I had to do this fast. And so this book was produced, Dora's manuscript was assessed by the Historical Commission, approved, and we went forward, and it is now in print. So it's very, very exciting. So you're going to be in for a treat this evening. The 4 of these women, and they're each going to come up and go at it for a little bit, and while they speak, you might have a question that comes to your mind. Tuck it away, remember it, and there will be a roving mic here, and you can ask that question later during the Q&A time. So, in order of appearance in the book, first we have Laura Kalmar, and I'm going to just read the little bio piece. They're lovely photos that each of these women submitted, and I found a way to put them in at the back of the chapter, and you see their little bio blurb is here too. So this is what Laura wrote. Laura Kalmar lives in Winnipeg with her husband and 2 children, and one of whom is right beside her today. Sorry to embarrass you, I'm sorry. And is surprised now to be a full-fledged sports mom, having herself failed at most athletics. She works as Director of Marketing and Communications for MCC Canada and attends the Eastview Community Church here in Winnipeg, where she serves in children's ministry. So please, let's have a warm welcome to Laura as she comes up here and tells us some of her story.
Yeah, thanks, John. I came to this project very hesitantly when Dora approached me and asked me to contribute to this anthology. And I was a little bit anxious because I knew that it was, like John said, very personal writing, and I needed to share my heart. But when I saw the lineup of women, the company that I would keep in this project was incredible. And I would say that most every woman in this book who wrote a chapter were part of my own journey and really inspired me and blessed me along the way. And I came in tonight and somebody said, Mary said, "Oh yeah, I remember you. You were the young, up-and-coming young woman." And I maybe still feel that way, even though I'm not. But I do feel like I was given opportunity and given experience that was incredible for me. And it really carved a path for my life. And now that I serve with MCC, as Director of Communications and Marketing, I really feel like the experiences that were given to me through the MB Church and those experiences of leadership and ministry have guided me to where I am today. So it's been a gift, but I also know that there's many other women who didn't experience that. And I really was granted this space and doors were open to me that I know didn't exist for a lot of other women. And so I'm here celebrating, sharing my story, but also lamenting for the many women who didn't get that opportunity, and even today, I would say, may not continue to have that opportunity. So there's some lament in this sharing. But I do, again, want to say that the company that I keep with these other women continues to inspire me, continues to uplift me, and it's very interesting, John, that you held up that Women Among the Brethren book by Katie Funk-Wiebe. And Katie was always, I never knew her and I never met her, but really kind of through you, I was very inspired by her story. She was a writer and I was kind of following in her footsteps that way. But I don't know if you know that her mom was one of the very first MCC workers who served in the soup kitchens in Ukraine just over 100 years ago, feeding people who were starving from famine and being persecuted. And it was so incredible to feel that link with Katie and her mom, and now I'm serving with MCC. And there have been women who have just been incredible role models all along, and I am a part of that. So I just want to read a tiny bit from this. I think I have 2 more minutes, John, or so. My chapter is called Girl and God, and this is just a little snapshot from my young adulthood, when I really feel like some of those doors were open to me and my experiences began as a woman in ministry leadership. I was 21 years old when I started attending Willingdon MB Church in Burnaby, BC. It was the early 1990s and my curls were just recovering from the big hair craze of the 80s. My friends and I spent hours dreaming of meeting a godly man, getting married, and pursuing a life of ministry with our spouses. We shaped our thinking around Elizabeth Elliot's Passion and Purity, a book that encouraged women to wait patiently and prayerfully for a husband of God's choosing, carefully guarding our hearts and keeping our sexual desires in check until that time. To some degree, we were told to be suspicious of love, recognizing it as a trap that could steal away affection from Jesus. We were also told to be wary of female sexuality, recognizing our femininity as a source of temptation to our Christian brothers. Although we were Eliot fangirls, shaped by the prevalent evangelical theology of the day, we didn't become isolated homebodies. We were quite capable of giving God a hand while we waited, with absolute pure thoughts, of course, longing for our prayers for marital bliss to come to fruition. I remember several picnic dates planned and executed by our 20-something group of Burnaby babes. We attended many friends' weddings, applying a bit of extra mascara and secretly hoping we'd meet the one God was preparing for us. Skip ahead a few years. Meanwhile, doors began to open for me. I was surprised when I received an invitation to step into a leadership role during my final years at university. I had decided to put my post-secondary education on hold for a year, deferring my teaching practicum to embark on a 5-month mission trip across Canada. Randy Friesen, the then leader of YMI, Youth Mission International, which was a short-term discipleship ministry run by MB Mission or Multiply Now, asked me to co-lead with a male member of the very first action team. I protested, saying that wasn't my position. And Randy looked at me and said, I see leadership qualities in you. And so that was the very first shoulder tap for me. From January to May 1993, we traveled across the country in a van, braving winter blizzards and staying in the homes of MB hosts. And again, 2 years later, during my second short-term mission trip with YMI, I was given another opportunity to lead. I spent the summer of 1995 in the Maritimes, learning more what it meant to be a servant leader, as our entire ministry team lived together in an old fire station in Lower Sackville, Nova Scotia. You can imagine what it was like to live with a bunch of 20-somethings in an old firehouse in Nova Scotia. We quickly discovered the joys and challenges of sharing a small space with 10 roommates, and we also learned quite quickly what it meant to look to the needs of others. Those leadership opportunities shifted something inside of me, probably just ever so slightly at that point. I felt empowered. I felt affirmed. I felt closer to Jesus and more certain of who he had made me to be. I began to recognize that one of the gifts he had given me was leadership. The word that was spoken into my life by the community around me, by both women and men, and confirmed by the opportunities arriving on my doorstep. That fact both surprised and energized me, pushing at the edges of my belief. That was the beginning. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. We now have Mary Reimer, and this is what she writes. Mary Reimer enjoys an active practice in spiritual direction. She and friend Susan Moore published a book of poems and drawings titled Benchmark, done as a weekly exercise in capturing beauty during COVID. Mary treasures time with family, and some of them are here too, and leads Imago Dei Winnipeg in contemplative practices. She and husband Gary laugh every day at their Labradoodle named Violet. So, Mary, please, let's welcome her.
Thank you, John. We've left Violet alone. We don't know what we'll return to at the end of this evening, but we do have cause to laugh and weep sometimes and gnash our teeth at that dog. I'm really moved this evening that when I look out at you, I see the strong, makes me feel kind of weepy, the strong women that have been part of my life for so many years. I see someone who introduced me to Taizé music years ago, and at the time I kind of rolled my eyes at this strange new form of music, and in our years since then, that has become so important to Gary and I and to the work that I do in spiritual direction. And I see someone who stood up for me as a pastor when I was a little intimidated by the board, and she went in there and took them on to get some equity in a salary issue. I see women who have my back for years of faithful meeting, and it's really quite moving just to see you all in the same room together. So thank you. I think I'll use most of my time to just read a few little bits from my chapter, if that's okay. For me, writing this chapter was very much like the spiritual practice of examen, where we get to look back at our day or at our part of the day and see where was God in this, and where did I perhaps miss out on noticing God's presence or involvement in my life. And this was a bit of an opportunity to look at a very long examen and to look for ways that maybe I missed the presence of God, and to celebrate those times that I revisited. So I'll jump around a little, but I'm aware that this book holds a fair bit of pain. And I didn't realize that until I read the whole thing. It sat on my table for a week before I had the courage to actually open it and read your stories. So there's a lot of emotion in the stories. And mine is maybe a little less painful because of the way that I was introduced and invited into ministry in several ways. So in November 2019, before any thoughts of pandemic, before the whole world began to change, in many respects to wake up, I embarked with my husband, Gary, upon a 64-mile walk in Scotland, the Fife Pilgrim Way. Small by Camino de Santiago standards, but long enough to test 2 prairie seniors with sedentary lifestyles. November is not the optimal month for a trek through Scotland, which explains why we never met another pilgrim along the way. When mired down in troughs of mud through a farmer's field, or panting our way up hills that seemed at that moment Everest-like, we trudged along learning life lessons, drawing on reserves of strength, humor, and determination. It was indeed a true pilgrimage in that it mirrored the ups and downs of life, reflecting microcosmic moments of almost every emotion and reaction within the time capsule of 7 days. And so my chapter kind of has that journey, that pilgrimage as the spine to which the rest of it is attached. Writing this chapter is like a pilgrimage for me. I am retracing familiar territory, but from a new perspective. I'm looking forward to where this path may take me. My question along the way is, Lord, what do I know, or what have you placed within me to better understand and to more clearly see each stopping place along the way? My reflections these days are drawn to thoughts of being made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, each one of us with a common DNA that holds the character of God. At a time when the global picture seems to be experiencing a seismic shift, when a once powerful nation is imploding and we are looking at a new world order, I am straining to see the image of God imprinted on each person. The COVID-19 pandemic is not the root cause of this chaos, but like any formidable foe, it has rushed to exploit and reveal weaknesses. We find ourselves on the brink of an opportunity to evaluate, reflect, rethink, and pivot. Basil, the bishop of Caesarea, one of the Cappadocian fathers, taught that although we are each and every one of us made in the image of God, by our thoughts and actions we choose to move toward or away from the likeness of God. And this means that each day is best based and evaluated not upon our successes and failures, our willpower or weaknesses, but solely upon the pursuit of making choices that increase our likeness to Jesus. In the context of this writing, it is my desire and intention to remember and to reflect through the clarity of that lens. Dallas Willard wisely speaks, we can become like Christ by doing one thing, by following him in the overall style of life he chose for himself. skipping ahead a little bit after having lived in Vancouver for a few years, having returned to Winnipeg and having been asked to apply for a 6-month internship at my church, I hoped I might contribute to make it a safe and welcoming environment for all who were drawn even tentatively through its doors. I was thrilled to accept the internship, even though it meant leaving a comfortable, established teaching position in a great school community. I knew in contemplating the position that I was being given a choice and that God would continue to work in and through me if I turned it down. But I sensed that I was invited into an adventure, and to say no would leave me always wondering what might have been. I loved going to work at the church. I had to restrain myself from getting there too early. I thrived on the collegiality of the staff, learning the rhythms and workings of the season in the church year, the opportunities for prayer and planning. And soon my initial mandate of worship design and small groups expanded to include women's ministry, a noon-hour walking group, and the Alpha course. Congregational meetings were sometimes disheartening. There were those who felt my salary would be better spent on an addition to the building. Some felt, no offense, Mary, a woman on staff was not necessary. They did not see the well-used pathway to my office. They did not notice that not just women, but some men too felt safer talking to a woman and were able to address issues that had never been brought into the healing light of Christ. Through a more graceful lens, I can see now that these were good people who had their own visions of how things should be. Most were kind, many were appreciative, and enough were openly supportive, so I was able to learn and grow and live into the role of pastor as the internship became a permanent part-time position. A few months into this work, the senior pastor left on sabbatical, and I was given that role and salary while he was away. The church also hired an experienced retired pastor to help with the preaching load. These were remarkable months of delightful teamwork, during which I felt mentored and encouraged by my colleague. I conducted my first weddings, first bedside death and funeral, and had my first pastoral encounter with mental illness. It was a crash course in Parenting 101 and was to stand me in good stead in the near future. What comes to mind when I think about those first years of ministry are the beautiful times of connection, like the women's retreats where laughter and tears were welcome and women of all ages explored who they were as daughters of God. We witnessed healing in body, mind, and soul as we prepared for and hosted the Alpha course over and over and over again. One young Alpha group leader said, "I keep coming back because this is where I see God at work. It's like being in Acts 2, and I don't want to miss anything." In my teaching career, I had experienced a lot of affirmation and very little criticism. It came as a shock then that everything I did or said as pastor was open to evaluation and opinion. The pews were stocked with encouragement cards meant for words of affirmation, verses, or prayers of support and encouragement. And too often these were used to express personal feelings regarding preferences, and too often done anonymously. Today, I would handle things differently, as I'm more able to acknowledge my own weaknesses while seeing the woundedness of others. I was too easily offended, hurt, and bewildered. Whereas I had begun with unbridled enthusiasm, I came to be on the defensive, trying to interpret glances, conversations, and rumors. But during that time, I began a helpful, lifelong practice of asking myself, what do you know, and what do you imagine? These questions helped me to separate reality from conjecture and have saved me from a lot of unproductive thinking. Almost done. After 6 years as an associate pastor, I was ready to welcome our first grandchild and become a stay-at-home grandma. I resigned my position and looked forward to the safety and a calmer place. But one evening, as my husband and I visited with our lead pastor and his spouse, we began to brainstorm about what we would do if we could do anything we really wanted. And out of that came a proposal for a church plant based on a community of people with a common purpose and commitment to discipleship. We took the proposal to the Provincial Conference Missions Committee, which gave approval to begin the process, saying, "If this looks like every other church, you will have failed." So with excitement and anticipation and curiosity, we began to dream and pray this little church into existence. My colleague and his spouse were given a church planter's aptitude test and interview, but I was not offered the same. The church was and is based on a co-pastor relationship, and so working according to gifts and experience, each pastor was able to do any aspect of church life as needed. And so we officially launched in September 2002. Our first office was back-to-back desks in the third story of Art Nalvina's beautiful and welcoming home. When one of us met with someone in the office, the other would move next door to the magnificent bathroom, complete with library, until the meeting was over. Those first 2 years of FaithWorks were filled with wonder, joy, and exhaustion. Many of us did multiple jobs. The same people might set up sound equipment, sing in the worship group, and make coffee in one evening. The children were passed among the adults and welcomed into all aspects of worship. It was a rich, heady, and spiritually vibrant time. Prayer was not an add-on, but a lifeline. Worship was an expression of gratitude and a commitment to do life together as disciples of Jesus. To the best of our abilities and by the grace and power of God, I've completely lost my place. So we'll just turn the page here and finish off. Anyway, that was that part. You kind of got the gist. One of the practices of pilgrimage is an openness to each moment, each experience, and each encounter during the day. On the Fife Pilgrim Way, that meant finding value in the bus driver's cheery greeting in the morning darkness and examining my own sharp response to my husband and desire to place blame when things went sideways. It meant pausing to ask for help and giving thanks for the astonishing encounter with a stranger in a swampy cow patch who turned us in the right direction. Boredom with walking the same few blocks each day had led him to this mucky field and to our rescue. We learned the richness of each person, the value in each story, and the vastness of God's love and presence ministered through strangers. My hope for our faith communities is that we might be people who are curious, welcoming, and willing to hear and learn from the stories of others. I pray for openness in our community to tell our stories, stories of God's presence and sometimes absence. When obstacles to shalom rise up, and they will, I pray that we will be a strong body, a body with shared vision and a desire to search and pray our way together. Walking along a narrow path just before noon, and again in the rain, we encountered a solitary sheep stretched across the path, showing no sign of moving anytime soon. We were faced with the choice of squeezing past one end or the other. But which end promises the least potential harm, we asked ourselves. Do sheep kick with the back legs or bite with the front end? But our fears were in vain. We could have walked right over him, as he did not seem the least bit interested in two scruffy Canadians. And so often my thoughts and fears do not match reality, and I am reminded to ask what is real and what do I imagine. When I turn my thoughts to what I know to be true, I am like the psalmist who, faced with fear, anger, or despair, or sometimes all three, turns his mind to the productive thinking of all that God has done and been in the past. Jeanette Bucky in Holy Invitations writes, the disciples learned to trust Jesus by watching, listening, asking questions, and making mistakes. This sums up pilgrimage as followers of Jesus. Grace extended to self and others along the way draws us together in community. Together, the Christian community watches, listens, and creates a place where questions are welcomed and mistakes are forgiven. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Special. Another Mary, after 25 years in pastoral ministry, Mary Anne Isaak is still energized by the challenge and beauty of involvement in the life of the church. So, to relax, she does watercolor painting and will accept any invitation to play Scrabble. She and her husband John have 2 adult children. So, Marianne, please.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. It is an honor to be included in this book on holy ground. And John pointed out a couple of books that are in the line of the legacy of this, and I brought another, and I noticed Elfrieda did too, so maybe we'll say something similar. But All Our Witnesses is a book that Dolores Friesen put out almost 25 years ago. And she collected sermons from 40 women, Mennonite Brethren women, and published them. And this was early on when I was starting my pastoral career, or actually perhaps even before I started. And I was invited to contribute a sermon, and that was one of those experiences of being tapped on the shoulder, hearing that you have a voice, you have something to offer. Of these 40 women, 7 are in on holy ground. 7 are ones that Dora has selected as being leaders. And so that power of being tapped on the shoulder, I think that, Laura, you talked about that as well, and that's really, really a significant thing. Dolores was the person who said to me once, if someone is your cheerleader, hold that person close. Another honor for me for this book is the cover. Last October, John and I went to visit our kids in Frankfurt, and Rihanna and Benny have a big empty wall in their apartment, and she said, "Mom, I want a painting here that's meaningful." And so I painted this picture. It is 5.5 feet tall and 8 feet wide, and Rihanna came home and helped me in the evenings, and it is a picture of the Lord's Supper reimagined. Reimagined because it has not just the 12 disciples, but it has many characters from gospel stories, and women included. So it is Jesus breaking the bread and pouring the cup, break and pour. That's the gospel in 4 words, break and pour. Break yourself open, pour yourself out in love. But it also has the woman with the alabaster jar who broke it open and poured it out, a disciple who is mirroring the actions of her master. And then it has Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, and Martha with her working towel, and Lazarus holding on to Jesus for dear life. And it has the little boy who brought his lunch to Jesus, and maybe his mom who packed the lunch for him. And it has, this woman in the front who's saying, come and see. Could be Mary Magdalene at the tomb, or it could be the woman at the well saying to the people in her village, come and see. Anyway, it was an honor to have that included. We made this, John and I made this into a Christmas card and sent it out, and Dora said, "Oh, that picture has a lot of holy ground in it. Jesus is the light." And so she asked permission to use it, and it's an honor to have both words and visual art included in this book. Before I read a piece, I want to mention the practice of story weaving. Story weaving, and oops, I'm going to take this off. I have, going back to All Our Witnesses, I have 5 unread, almost unopened copies of All Our Witnesses. When they were getting rid of them here in Winnipeg at the bookstore, Dolores said, "Oh, can you keep some? And if anyone ever wants them, just hand them out." And so if you're interested in a book of women leaders sharing their sermon from 25 years ago, these are free for the taking. One of the practices that has formed me over the decades is story weaving. And when something significant happens in my life, I choose a biblical story and put it alongside. And then I look at how these stories inform one another. Where does God show up in the biblical story? Oh, can I see God showing up in a similar way in my own story? How does this biblical story challenge my story? How does it affirm my story? How does it bless my story? What kinds of questions do I ask? And back and forth. And so that practice started, well, like I said, decades ago. When I was early on in my pastoral career, there was an incident that I felt very challenged by, very almost pushed to the wall. And I looked for a biblical story that I could do some story weaving with. And the story I came up with was Jacob and Esau. Jacob ended up with the blessing, but it was Esau's to begin with. And somehow Esau lost the blessing, and it was given away to Jacob. That's how I've always told the story to myself. But as I went back and looked at it, Jacob didn't just rest with his blessing being stolen. He went back to his father. He went back to the family. He went back to the family where the narrative was there's only one blessing, and that's all there is. And he said, "Bless me to my father." And Isaac gives Esau a blessing. And it's not as robust, and it's not as easy. It has challenges in it, but it is a blessing. And Esau lives into that blessing. And for me, with the story weaving, I ended up saying, oh, in our family of faith, the Mennonite Brethren, perhaps the men are like Jacob and the women are like Esau. And I was experiencing something that felt like I have some gifts, I have some calling into leadership, but it feels like that's being stolen and given away. Can I be an Esau that just doesn't give in to the narrative that says there's only a blessing for one? Can I keep saying, bless me too, my church family? And can I live into the blessing that is there? So that I don't become bitter, because it's really easy to become bitter. And so that story weaving with the story of Jacob and Esau became very pivotal for me early on. And I've gone on to use other stories to weave into my own. But the chapter for me is a hunger for the blessing, and that comes from that story of Jacob and Esau. And then before I read a little bit, I just want to mention the shoes that I chose to wear today because these shoes show up in this chapter. And early on, the very first funeral I did was a feisty woman named Elda Plank. And after she died, her husband invited me over, and he said, before Elda died, she and I would come to church and we'd look at the feet of all the women in church, and we'd try and figure out who could fit into Elda's shoes, because she had a unique foot form and unique footprint. And we figured out, Marianne, that you were maybe the only person who could fit into Elda's shoes. And so I was invited to the Plank household, and there were about 40 pairs of shoes lined up, covering the whole living room. And I was invited to try on every single pair of shoes and hear the story that went into the purchase of those shoes from different corners of the world. It was walking through grief with a widow. And then I was gifted these shoes under the condition that I would never give them to a thrift store. So I've had a lot of high-heeled shoes, and I don't often, for some reason, I don't often buy high-heeled shoes, and yet I have many to wear. And I I won't go into that story now, but it does have a role in my story as a female leader, because the size of women makes a big difference in leadership, and sometimes that's welcome and sometimes it's not. And it's interesting the comments that one receives. So I'll leave that story there, and hopefully it's enough of a teaser for you to want to purchase the book yourself. I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs, and this is from a moment in our lives. We had just been invited to move to Fresno, California. John was starting his role as the New Testament professor at the MB Seminary. I was starting as a pastor at College Community Church, Mennonite Brethren. That's in Clovis, California, but Clovis is to Fresno like St. Boniface is to Winnipeg. So basically it's a church in Fresno. And the transition to Fresno, to pastoring, was made very smooth. I worked with a colleague, Bill Braun, who was a cheerleader, and the theme of cheerleaders showing up, or allies showing up, is really strong. Anyway, Bill was a cheerleader and made that shift to pastoral work at College Community something that was quite smooth, actually. The shift from the Canadian Mennonite Brethren context to the American was more jarring at the level of denominational structures. Our family's move to California coincided with the move of the U.S. Mennonite Brethren Conference to create its own National Board of Faith and Life when the North American Board of Faith and Life was being dissolved. And I had the honor at that point of being invited on as a young person to the binational, the Canadian-U.S. Board of Faith and Life, and had 2 years of really invigorating experience on that Board of Faith and Life. All members of the North American Board who lived in the U.S. were automatically nominated to the new U.S. Board, and that now included me. At the convention, where the nominations were to be affirmed, several conference leaders approached me together during the morning coffee break and then again at lunch, immediately before the vote. They requested that I voluntarily remove my name from the slate of nominees for the U.S. Board of Faith and Life. They explained to me that they had recently found out about a decision made by the congregation where I pastored, a decision made years before I came to the church, about a situation that I was completely unaware of. And they suggested that decision back in history made our congregation unqualified to have one of its pastors on the Board of Faith and Life. I was a young pastor at that point. Though flustered, and I would say deeply flustered, by what felt to me like an ambush, I declined to withdraw my name. I had processed my upcoming role on the U.S. Board of Faith and Life with our congregation's leadership commission. It wasn't a solo decision to accept the position. Neither could it be a solo decision to withdraw my name. One man in that conversation looked at me and asked, "Why won't you submit?" After lunch, the vote took place. Someone from the floor nominated a male to the slate, and I was not voted into the position. I suspected, but did not know, that the reason they wanted me to withdraw my name was because I was a woman. And that suspicion cracked open a space in my spirit where resentment could begin to creep in. And knowing that resentment is character forming, I clung to the promise of Esau, that God and the family still had a blessing for me too. This is not how a community of faith treats one another. That was the consensus of my congregation's leadership commission when I relayed my experience. Hallway politics, last-minute surprise, imbalance of power between one person and three, between novice pastor and senior conference leaders. These are not signs of a healthy community. Our church leadership commission invited Henry H. Dick, executive director of the Pacific District Conference and spokesperson for that trio of leaders, to a meeting and invited him to bring a witness in support, Larry Martins, former seminary president and respected leader among the USMBs. And I'm using actual names here. My first inclination was to just be really generic and not name names. But when I read Dora's essay, she named a lot of names. So I said, okay, I'll follow suit. And every name that's named in this book, if that person is still alive, I have checked with them. Does your memory of this event match my memory? And if it doesn't match, then in one case, John dug into archives of Bethany Bible School, Bethany Bible Institute, and we found the minuted notes. Yes, okay, this clarifies some memory of mine. So anyway, names have been, I have checked these with people who are alive. Henry came. He listened. He heard our heart. He accepted that he was in the wrong. He apologized to me and to the Leadership Commission. And I should say, ever after, for the whole 13 years that I was part of College Community Church, whenever I would meet him at a conference or an assembly, he would come up to me and look me straight in the eye and shake my hand and check that things were okay. He apologized to me and to the Leadership Commission, and then he told his story. We listened. We heard his perception of our congregation making several questionable decisions in the past that we kept under the radar. We heard a story of slowly growing mistrust. We heard him confront a lack of transparency. This is not how we treat one another in the family of faith. And our Leadership Commission made a commitment to transparency in the future. And that has been a very shaping, very transformational encounter for me. That's what I say in the next paragraph. For me, that Matthew 18 confrontation was transformational. It helped me integrate the convention encounter into my story, not as resentment against a body that resists women, but rather as commitment to transparency and respect in relationship, even when perspectives are different. This is how we treat one another in the family of faith. Oh, and I'm gonna, because Julie's here, I'll read the next paragraph too. I carried that lesson into ministry in Canada, where I am currently team lead in a trio of pastors with Aaron Thiessen and Julie Dirksen at River East Church in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. One more, and then there's a chance for some Q&A. So, after working as a sessional instructor and private tutor in Kitchener-Waterloo, Elfrieda Neufeld Schroeder retired in Winnipeg, working on translation and writing projects. She is a worship leader and occasionally preaches at Jubilee Mennonite Church. She walks daily, enjoys playing Scrabbles. There's a theme here, with her husband and relating to her 8 grandchildren. So please, let's welcome Elfrieda.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. And I think Marianne and I have a few things in common. Like this book, All Our Witnesses. The first sermon I never preached is in this book. It's a story about Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus at the graveside. And Dolores Friesen published it in 1996. It was a time when Kitchener women were really trying hard to get women to be recognized as pastors, and we were often frustrated. I think I'm the second oldest person. Dolores is the oldest one. So my time goes back even further than most of you. I do remember meeting Laura Kalmar at one point, and I think it was, can't remember, a mission group of some kind. Anyways, she was so young, and we were rooting for her as well. And Dolores is also in Dora's book 26 years later, so I feel a commonality with her. When I was baptized and took my first communion, and that was in the Springfield Heights Mennonite Church, I had come from Alberta and didn't know anybody. My parents decided they wanted to go to this church. I was used to a small evangelical church, not even a Mennonite church in Didsbury, Alberta, but here we were in this big church. The pastor suggested that we pray for God to provide what our heart's desire would be for our future. Guess what my prayer was? Same as Laura's. Give me a husband who would be a pastor or a missionary. I did not even envision myself in either of these roles. It wasn't an option at the time. And when Dora asked me to contribute a chapter to this volume, I was really surprised. The subtitle reads, Stories by and about Women in Ministry Leadership in the Mennonite Brethren Church. My comment to Dora, I'm not a minister. And I wondered how many other people would say that. She didn't bat an eye. You're a missionary, aren't you? Yeah, I was for 15 years in Congo. Dora, did you know that the MB Conference used to ordain missionaries? Oh yeah, I had forgotten about that. I checked. From 1919 to 1954, 37 Canadian women, 19 of whom were single, were ordained as missionaries. The conference rescinded the ordination of women in 1957 and commissioned women missionaries instead. And I'll read a paragraph from my article. The brethren, it seems, were stuck on creation order and forgot to look at the book of Acts, where the Holy Spirit comes to believers and creates a new order. That's why I was blessed rather than ordained when Hardy and I left for Congo. At the time, I didn't know this history. Now I'm wondering, had I been ordained for service, would that have made a difference in the way I felt about my assignment? However, the encouragement and affirmation received by early MB missionaries kept the embers of hope alive. In 2008, Hardy and I moved from Kitchener to Winnipeg. We joined Jubilee Mennonite Church, affiliated with both the Mennonite and MB conferences. This church was originally established with the purpose of giving women equal opportunity in all areas of church service. It was an outreach of Springfield Heights Mennonite Church. I was asked to be a worship leader, which I enjoyed. For a time, we were without a pastor, who would deliver the sermons, we looked within. Two former pastors agreed to preach occasionally. Mary Funk, one of the church founders, was willing to preach, as was Wanda Dirksen. I was asked if I would preach a sermon, and to the surprise of the person who asked me, Terry Gertson, I agreed at once. I had an idea for a sermon in my desk drawer that I could see myself preaching, but hadn't been courageous enough to volunteer. When someone finally asked me, I felt liberated to do so and enjoyed it. I have since preached several times. One of my sermons was about the events of Act 2, which inspired such wonder in the early church, and especially verse 17. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. In my sermon, I shared that when we went to Congo as missionaries, the Congolese taught us so much, and now they are leading us in ordaining women for ministry. It was the MB Church of Congo, the people we had gone out to serve in the late 1960s, that led to the way in creating opportunities for women in ministry in the MB conference. And I'm reading from my book. The Congolese asked a simple question. If the Holy Spirit was poured out on women as well as on men in Acts 2, should the church withhold its blessing in ministry? On August 24th, 2003, just days after returning to Kinshasa from the Mennonite World Conference, Mama Kadi Chinyama was ordained to the pastorate by the Mennonite Brethren Church of Congo. At that time, no other Mennonite Brethren Conference had ordained women for pastoral ministry, although many allowed women to serve in leadership roles. Today, there are some 50 Mennonite Brethren churches in Kinshasa, the capital city, and 1/4 of the pastors are women. Ron Taves, our former pastor at Kitchener MB Church, who received a Distinguished Alumni Award at Canadian Mennonite University, shared at the ceremony how he would never have become a pastor had not someone tapped him on the shoulder and asked him to consider it. When I was taking courses by correspondence at the University of Waterloo and inquired timidly about distance education in the German department, a professor said, "What's wrong with coming on campus?" Had he not done so, I might never have finished my degree. Now in my mid-70s, I have come late to this part of service to God and the church, that of speaking God's truth more formally in a church service. Had I been encouraged earlier, would I have gone to seminary instead of university? Perhaps. I hadn't seen a future for myself in that role. No one tapped me on the shoulder.
Well, thank you, everyone, for speaking, telling your stories and sharing. And we do have time for some questions, and I see a mic walking its way. Actually, someone is carrying that mic and is coming here. Thank you. I think it's going to come in the middle aisle here. So there is a mic up right in front of Hardy here. So if you have a question for one, or maybe all, you might have a general question. So you could either address it to one of these 4 women, or you could have a general question, and we could see who comes to the mic to answer it. So does anyone want to start with a question that you have for Laura, Mary, Marianne, and Elfrieda? I did make one just because I thought, I better have one on the ready. So if I say mine first, that might loosen things up a little bit for you. So well, see, I'm going to try this one out. Okay, so each of you have spoken about the challenges of ministry and how your voice has been validated. But what I noticed is your validation group is really tight around you. It's a family, it's church, it's your local church that calls you, etc. So my question is, why do you think, because each of you also referenced that it still is difficult. So my question is, and this is general, any one of you could answer it if you choose. Why do you think it remains difficult in other circles, like beyond your cheerleading crowd, to validate a voice of women in leadership? Who wants to jump? Is that too vague? Go for it. Thank you, Laura.
Why do I think it's difficult? I think I was reflecting that my own congregation, 10 years after the national conversation about women in ministry leadership, my own congregation here in Winnipeg was having the same conversation. And it raised all the same questions, all the same angst, and perhaps predictably, it resulted in a wedge between people in the congregation, and many people left. And that was a decade later, a decade after that initial conversation that happened nationally. So why does that continue to happen in circles? I think there's a lot of fear, and I do think that there's fear of a slippery slope. So if it's women who are given that freedom and have doors opened, then what will happen? And just this sort of the center cannot hold and everything's just going to fall apart. And that's perhaps the first sort of brick, and other things will start to fall apart if that happens. That's a theory. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
I recently had a conversation with David Weeb, and he used to be the executive director of the Canadian Mennonite Brethren Conference, and he was telling a story of in the early 2000s when he was in that role, he had just come into that role, he had an open space meeting for between 40 and 50 leaders. You're nodding, Andrew. Were you there? Okay. And you were there too. Okay. Well, I just know it by the story he told this week. And an open space means there's structure to the conversation, and people come and they spend about 4 days together, but it's very open. The agenda gets created by the people there. And the question that he brought to the table, the organizing question, was, how do we encourage young leaders to step into ministry? And so if somebody puts an idea on the whiteboard, their name goes beside it, and they generated about 35 ideas to explore. Whoever suggested it then led that workshop for an hour, whether they were an expert or not. And over the course of several days, there were lots of workshops on all these different ideas, and they took notes, and those notes got posted up, and then people kept reading through those notes, and at the end, they reduced the ideas to 10 action points. That's how I heard the story. Does that match your memory of what happened? It was a long time ago. Anyway, he said that the suggestion number two was to encourage women in leadership, which hadn't been done till that point. In the 90s had been that contentious conversation, and then there was a moratorium of talking about women in leadership. And then it came from somebody in a position within the Mennonite Brethren structure David, who started that, but then also it was an idea that was kind of scattered to the wind and people could pick it up. And he said he saw things starting to change when they became deliberate about saying, how do we then go about tapping women on the shoulder? And I think there is the tight circle of people who see your heart and see your strengths and say, oh, I'm going to call you into ministry. That's really important. Yeah. But then there's this other level of structural change that when that happens, there's a really significant change that happens. So that would be like the personal calling, the structures, having that vision. And then thirdly, I think our society. I read a book during COVID called Why Does Patriarchy Persist? Not why does it exist, but why does it persist? Because there's a lot of other things about society. We say, oh, this isn't right, and then we work at it and we see change. But patriarchy has been around for millennia. And I think there are ways in which we globally treat men and women that divide us into unhealthy parts of ourselves, and that also needs to be addressed.
Systemic stuff, Okay. Abe, come to the mic. Help us with a good question.
Not a question, but a remark, perhaps a comment, reflecting on the River East experience. When River East went through some of those issues, one of the ways to deal with it, the local congregation, our congregation sometimes said, we don't have seniors pastors. I mean, part of the idea was that women shouldn't be senior pastors, they could be assistant pastors. So we have leadership teams, or a pastoral team, not a senior pastor. But in all other respects, we really had a senior pastor, a woman, but we got around the ordination thing as well as the senior pastor thing by kind of in a slippery way in some respects, I think.
Some terms, defining terms. Here's another question. Thank you, Abe, for that reflection.
Hi. I read through these stories, and I observed a lot of...
Now I recognize who you are.
Sorry, Janessa, hi. I read through these stories, and I recognized stories of endurance through a lot of difficulty, and I found myself deeply encouraged and also quite ragey at the same time, and kind of ping-ponging back and forth between this. And I could add a whole monologue, but I won't, to the background for this. But I guess at the end of the day, I feel like I hear all these stories of endurance, but I am in a culture that has said enough is enough in a lot of ways and encourages people to just kind of exit because it's not worth it. And so I guess I feel the tension between this long struggle and this also self-advocacy that is, both have merit. And I guess the question I have is what has kept you? Why MBs? There's a lot of cases in here for leaving, but there's these beautiful stories of staying, and I stand the beneficiary of this book. So what makes you stay?
Why did you stay? Laura, Elfrieda, Marianne, Mary. Please.
Why stay? Because I stayed because I felt convinced, I still feel convinced, that that this was an invitation of God on my life. Just kind of relating to the past question, I remember addressing our congregation the week before a vote, an important vote on women in ministry, and asking for prayer and looking at the faces of those people, and there was just puzzlement because this was not an issue. The people in our church had me there from the beginning, and so they really didn't understand or weren't fussed about the issue. And I wonder if the fear of the unknown is part of the reluctance there, that once it's a norm, it simply wasn't an issue. And I was a little perturbed. I didn't know quite, will you pray about this? This is an important issue, folks. But I'm in it because I love it. I'm in it because every time I get a chance to preach, I feel new. I love the people that I get to move with in our church community, and I can't imagine doing anything else for life. I guess I see this as a call for life.
Right.
In whatever fashion I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Others, why did you stay?
I first got to know MBs when I went out to Congo, because I had been raised partly Mennonite church, partly an evangelical church, and that was a church that basically made me feel, or where I became a child of God. But when we went to Congo, there was this group of missionaries. They got together maybe once every 3 weeks for prayer and sharing and relating to each other and telling each other our problems. And there was also a lot of kind of stuff going on. We learned to work through these things, and prayer was always so genuine and moving. I remember this very senior lady missionary from, where was she from? Way out somewhere. Every once in a while she would come and she would kneel and pray. The rest of us didn't kneel, we were sitting. She knelt and she prayed very fervently. That fervency stayed with me, and I also had to learn to find my own spirituality, because it was kind of like COVID is here now. You didn't have stores to go to. You didn't have places to take your children. At one point, our eldest said, "Oh, my friends are gone. The missionary kids had left. Kids were out there playing." I said, "Look, there they are." She went out and she played with those kids and became part of their community. That all has formed me. And I'm sure there are, if Mennonite Church would probably have missionaries who would say similar things, I don't know. But just that fervency, and then later the bitterness of realizing that it wasn't all, that I wasn't the same as everybody else in certain areas because I was a woman, kind of made me angry about being in the MB church, but we fought a lot. And I remember one pastor or one person writing in the MB Herald, if we would just stop talking about this nonsense and get on with evangelizing the world. And I'm like, what do you think we're doing? You are leaving out half of the people who want to evangelize, and you're saying get on with evangel. So there was some of that. When we came to Winnipeg, we moved here after retirement, we were looking for a church, and we found one that was both MB and Mennonite. And I don't think there's even one person from our church here today, but it doesn't matter. I know they're right now having a community baby shower, and they're too busy doing that, and that's great. So we are back now and Hardy was originally from a Mennonite family of refugees who came here, met the wonderful MBs who sponsored them, became MBs, and it's in our heart and in our soul, and we wouldn't change it. That's why we fight so hard to be accepted as equal in this wonderful. And John, you've helped me a lot with translation work and stuff, so thank you.
Why am I still here? Oh my goodness, there are a lot of reasons for that. One is, and it's come up in the stories, the advocacy, the tapping on the shoulders, that is so powerful. So talking about the decision when, after that open space meeting where Canadian MB structures said, we want to promote women in ministry. That didn't maybe last, I don't experience that as continuing right now, but there was a season. And so I got invited to do things that meant a huge boost of self-confidence for me. And things like I got to preach at Mennonite World Conference. Well, it was the Mennonite Brethren opportunity for the Mennonite world in North America to choose a preacher. And so the powers that be ended up saying, which woman could preach? And I got invited, and that was just things like that make a huge difference. So that's the bigger structure, but also to live in very close quarters with a cheerleader. I don't know if you guys know John, but John is like a cheerleader through and through and through to the core. And so to come home and to be able to share, this is really hard, and then to keep hearing in word and in action, you can do this. And when I say in action, when we were in seminary, that was a long time ago, it was the men who studied and the women were that was still when we moved our families across borders. And the women were home very often. And John stayed home with the kids for me to go study. That wasn't a common practice, and he was willing to do that. An invisible thing. Most church boards, church council, church leadership commission, elder board, whatever you're going to call it, don't have a married couple both in the same board. And so because I've been on a church staff for, well, it's 26 years now, because that bio was written quite a while ago, it has meant that in any other context, John probably would have been on a church leadership commission. And for our whole married life, you haven't been, but that's because I've been a pastor. And so there's an invisible part of a relationship there that's really powerful for me. And I think another reason, this came up in our adult education this past Sunday. Someone asked a question, and it was about, why do we stay? It was not about me in particular, but our church has chosen the mission to be a Jesus community for the world. And we have chosen to live that out, embodying 3 values in particular: wisdom, prophecy, and compassion. And prophecy means speaking truth to systems and powers that aren't on the same page as you are, understanding how God is leading. And so how can you be prophetic if you agree with everything? So to be prophetic means to be in a position where your voice is needed because you sense that God wants something new to happen in this church structure. And so caring about the Mennonite Brethren has been part of what I've grown up with and inherited and embraced.
Thanks. I think there was a story that I was going to include in my chapter that I didn't because I wasn't quite sure how to write it. When I started attending some of the conventions and theological conferences, I witnessed women coming up to the mic. I witnessed Marianne coming up to the mic as part of that Board of Faith and Life in the U.S. And I noticed that the women who were listened to and given space were the ones who carried themselves with grace and confidence, and not that they always spoke, what people just wanted to hear, but they did it with the assurance that they had been gifted for that without anger. And I have pledged myself throughout my ministry that I would not be a person of anger in my leadership. And I don't know if I have succeeded in that always, but why do I stay right now? Because, Janessa, that's a hard question. Because if I left, I would be very angry and I would be very bitter, and that would be my reason. And so I can't go right now because I would just leave out of anger and bitterness. So, yep, that leaves me still here.
Well, perhaps you would have questions for these individuals later. I think, Arlen, we're at a point where we can transition. There's a few things that we can do, and you will be able to visit personally with each of these authors. And Arlen's going to explain how that works.
Thank you for a rich conversation. I was seated over there watching live stream, but I was catching it all. Thank you so much. As I said earlier, this conversation was recorded and will live on at commonword.ca, where folks from a distance can buy the book or borrow the book, or here anybody in store can also do the same. Just wanted to mention that on live stream there were about 15 individuals who joined us, and as far away as Australia and BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. So welcome, and I'm glad you all could join us as well. We have a book signing table, so there is that. If the four of you presenters want to sit there, and that would be a way for each of you to have a conversation with them if you'd like. And of course, the book is available in store to purchase. So as we go, may we engage and embrace, uphold and empower the stories and callings of women in the church. Indeed, may all silent stories find voice and expression and a listening, engaged audience. I wish you all good health and safety. Thank you, and good night.